Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, to OnPoint Technologies and PCM webinar today. We are thrilled to have you with us for Microsoft Azure webinar, and the topic is moving to the cloud. And to present on this topic, we have got John Pontius, who is Azure Solutions Sales Professional, and joining him will be Ken Pribble, who is Senior Microsoft Architect. Before going into our main presentation, we have got a few housekeeping items. Please remember to enter your question in the question box on your right hand side, and I'll relay those over to our speaker at the end of the presentation. We do send out a survey at the end of the webinar. Please fill it out and let us know how we did, as well as topic you'd like to see covered in the future. You should see the survey in your inboxes later today. We are also recording this session, which will be available for playback in the next few days. Recorded are posted on our webinar page, which will be www.onpoint.com/webinars and also www.pcm.com/webinars. And with that, we are going to go ahead and get started with our main presentation. I'm happy to hand it off to our main speaker, John Pontius and Ken Pribble. So,
thanks everybody for joining this afternoon. My name is John Pontius. I'm Azure Solutions Sales Professional at PCM OnPoint. And today we're going to talk a little bit about your hybrid cloud strategy with Microsoft Azure. The agenda for the webinar today, we're going to talk a little bit about what Azure is, how Azure and the public cloud are changing the ways that IT organizations are doing business, the way that they're going to market with solutions, the way that they're managing infrastructure. We're going to talk about why organizations are moving to Azure and some of the benefits. We're going to give an overview of some of the workloads that you'll need to think about to get started with a hybrid cloud strategy, as well as some of the workloads that we're seeing customers move into as a starter, dipping your toe in the public cloud and in Azure. And we're going to talk, and Ken's going to talk about how PCM approaches cloud adoption, what our methodology is, and what our services strengths are as you look for a partner in your move to the cloud, and as you look at how your cloud roadmap needs assistance from a partner. And then we'll close it with any questions and answers. So what is Azure? Azure is Microsoft's cloud platform made up of technologies and services that empower businesses to take advantage of cloud computing by provisioning and scaling the necessary resources on demand in a pay-as-you-go model. And this is sort of a sea change in the way that IT organizations think about how we can bring solutions to market and how we can innovate faster with technology. In the old paradigm, to get a project off the ground required, some type of meetings to get the project approved, a workflow process around procuring the necessary hardware. Very often that procurement process was elongated, and also you ended up with hardware that outpaced maybe the initial requirements of your project because you wanted to make sure that you'd future-proofed it for the next year, the next 3 years. So you wound up with, not being able to get certain projects approved because there wasn't enough confidence that they would succeed, higher budgets for projects because you needed to over-provision resources. And then virtualization changed some of that, but you still had kind of the same problems with, all right, how much are we allocating of our existing resources to project X, Y, and Z? And what Azure does is it turns all of that on its head, right? Because you can spin up resources on demand, and because you are paying for those resources as you go, so you're paying for your compute costs by the minute, you're paying for your storage costs by the gig, because of that, now we can start to talk about, okay, well, maybe this project doesn't have a high confidence of success, but because it's such a low cost to start out, we have a lot more flexibility about the things that we can do and the types of solutions that we can bring to management to improve our business. Because we're paying as you go, we're now aligning our IT budgets and our resources much more closely to the actual cost that that solution is, requiring, and the amount of cost that it's needed to drive that business process than we've ever been able to before. So there's obviously a bunch of stuff that goes into this about OpEx versus CapEx costs, and there are very real considerations to make around that. But really we're talking about aligning our IT budgets and resources much more closely to what we actually need to run our businesses. So Microsoft Azure There's sort of three pillars around Microsoft's cloud that differentiate it out in the marketplace from other offerings. It is global, it is trusted, and one of the things that we're going to strongly touch on during this webinar is that it is built from the ground up to be a hybrid model. Here are some high-level numbers that you can look at that really, the point of this slide is to talk about Microsoft is making a massive investment in their cloud and in their data centers. $15 billion, and that number is a little bit out of date, that Microsoft has invested in its cloud infrastructure. This is not a hobby. This is not a passion project for Microsoft. This is very clearly how they view the future of enterprise computing, and they're putting their money where their mouth is. So when you look out in the marketplace about what companies can bring to bear, the massive resources and economies of scale that are required to make cloud computing a reality and to make cloud computing cost effective for companies, Microsoft is one of the companies out there that can obviously provide that massive resources needed for that. 1,000 new subscriptions a day, a bunch of storage objects in Azure, but most importantly, this is backed by the full might of Microsoft's piggy bank. Global. So there are 34 Azure regions that are currently online. This is twice the number that AWS has. You can see all of the regions as orange dots here. You can see the planned ones in Korea Central and Korea South on here as well that are coming online later this year. And what this means is when you need to reach your customers and reach your employees wherever they are, when you need resources that are geolocated to improve quality of service and latency, Microsoft and Azure is the best place to put that. Additionally, by having a large number of regions where services can live, you cut down on something I'm sure most of you are aware that a couple weeks ago there was a big internet outage caused by a massive region of AWS going offline because there were lots and lots of services and lots of storage accounts located in a single AWS region. So not only is that, obviously problematic from a business perspective and from an internet perspective and from a customer perspective, but by increasing the number of regions that you have available and the number of places that you can have services deployed, you make it a lot easier to do high availability, things like that will keep a single region going offline or a single data center going offline from impacting you. Obviously, Microsoft makes huge investments in making sure that doesn't happen as well, in terms of how data is written into data centers, how certain types of machine sets are placed inside data centers and racks to prevent single points of failure. But one of the, we saw a couple weeks ago that doesn't always solve the problem, and one of the things that Microsoft also makes available is a massive number of regions and geographies that you can place services. Trusted, secure. So Microsoft's cloud technologies, not only Azure, which backends pretty much everything, but also things like Office 365, Dynamics 365, Power BI, are all built on top of a trusted cloud. And what that means is that these security features, compliance functionality, are built into the bedrock of where these services come from. They are not bolted on after the fact to meet certain compliance needs. All of this is available. You can see in the corner there at the Azure Trust Center. The Azure Trust Center is a single, Office 365 has one too, a single place, a base of knowledge for what compliance Microsoft has, how they are auditing for that compliance, any documentation related to that compliance. So they're very transparent about how they go about maintaining a compliant and secure cloud. I think a couple of years ago, there was very much a fear of security in the cloud for enterprises of a certain size. I think now that you've seen some of the major breaches, now that you've seen Sony, now that you've seen Target, that there's more of an acceptance that the major players out there are doing security very well, and they're actually doing it as good or better than some of the world's largest companies. But Microsoft is still going to make sure that its users are comfortable with the security and compliance of its cloud. So the ones on the side there, I'm not going to go through all of them, but HIPAA compliance, Microsoft will sign a BAA with you if you're dealing with protected health information. FedRAMP, Federal Authority to Operate, even in its commercial cloud, is a huge one. It obviously, if your cloud is good enough for many government agencies, it's very secure. There are, at the bottom you can see CJIS, there is Azure Gov that has additional compliance and security functionality. So if you're looking for CJIS compliance, Department of Justice, things like that. So IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS. Infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service versus software as a service. If you look at this chart down here, all the way on the left-hand side, you see kind of the traditional on-premise model. This is something we are all very familiar with. You own the entire stack. You potentially own the land that it's on. You own the lock that's on the door, and you own everything from the networking layer all the way up through the application. You can walk down the hallway. You can wrap your arms and hug your server. As we move into the cloud, parts of that stack and those layers start to get abstracted by the service provider. So in something like infrastructure as a service, we have virtual machines in the cloud. With something like Azure, Microsoft owns those servers. They're owning the networking all the way through the virtualization layer. You cannot run a Hyper-V host on Azure, although with some of the things they're doing with nested virtualization in 2016, some of that's changing. But right now, this is how it looks. But you own the OS. You own the data. You own the application. You are required for maintenance. You are required to update that operating system. But it looks very much like something you might have in your current data center today in your virtualized host. It just looks like a VM that lives in somebody else's spot, and we'll talk a little bit here in a second about ways that you can make those VMs look like they are in your data center. Moving up to platform as a service, now you see that we've abstracted even more of those layers of management from the end user and given more of it to the vendor so that you can deal with what's important. You can deal with your data and your applications. And then all the way on the right-hand side, you have software as a service. This is something like Office 365, where it is given to you. You have management capabilities. So Office 365 has like management parity with Exchange Online and things, but you don't own any of the underlying stuff. Microsoft manages that all for you. Generally speaking, as you move from left to right on this this chart, what you get is greater scalability and flexibility, and as you move from right to left, you get greater configurability. And it's important to think about when you're starting to talk about your cloud roadmaps about what you want to move. You should look at it from right to left. Things that can go in SaaS. So a great example of this, and obviously there's lots of SaaS providers out there, but a great example of this is Office 365 and Exchange Online. There's a lot of companies out there that have what we might call commodity software. These are table stakes for businesses. They are things that are required to work and work well, but they do not necessarily, they're not driving innovation, they are not differentiating your organization, they are not necessarily making you money. And email is a perfect example of that. An Exchange server going down is a great way to get a call from a CEO at 2 o'clock in the morning, but babysitting an Exchange server and making sure it's up all the time is not necessarily a competitive differentiator. You just have to have email. Those types of services are perfect for software as a service. Let somebody else manage that for you, provide the service that your end users need, provide the functionality that they need, but get your organization out of the problems of managing something like that. There will, and again, that's, things that you can take in SaaS, you should try SaaS first. It's all of the other stuff, and Azure really sits in the middle there in infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Infrastructure as a service is great when you're moving existing workloads out. I need that configurability. I have line of business applications that work a certain way that require certain access, and the virtual machine in the cloud is where that's going to look best, and it's not going to require any refactoring or re-architecting of the solution. Infrastructure as a service is great for that, and it's obviously, because it's very knowable, a way that a lot of companies will begin their approach to the cloud. But platform as a service, as you start to develop new applications, as you start to think about new ways to innovate on your business, as you start to give your developers, kind of empowering your developers to start using these cloud services, you should always think about architecting and platform as a service first. So SaaS for what you can do, PaaS for what you can do, IaaS for what you can do, and then at the bottom of it, there's probably still going to be stuff that remains on premises. Microsoft is fine with that. They understand companies have made huge investments into their on-premise stack, and we're going to talk about the ways that Microsoft enables that traditional on-premise architecture to work with the cloud. But again, this is, as you guys think about what my organization is going to take to the cloud and where our cloud roadmap starts, thinking about, okay, what do we want to put in IaaS? What do we want to put in PaaS? What do we think makes sense in SaaS is a great way to kind of start that conversation. Here you can see a not completely full but pretty comprehensive list of the services that encompass Azure. Point of this is to talk about, there's lots of different things in Azure. You will probably not utilize all of them, but you can see how utilizing a couple of them as you start to enter the new, as you start to move into the cloud will beget using other services. So at the bottom you see your infrastructure services. This is kind of what everything's built on, compute, storage, and networking. And then as you move to the higher level services, you see developer services, app platform services like Azure Web Apps. And then you get into things like analytics and IoT and big data, the stuff that really can only be done economically at cloud scale, the stuff that the cloud really excels at because the investment to do these things on-premise is just so massive that it really makes a lot of sense to look at these from the beginning of that project as cloud-ready solutions. So what workloads make sense in Azure? What drives a move to Azure? What is a huge reason that you might look at the public cloud for some of your workloads? Things that turn on and off. So when we're talking about that pay-as-you-go mentality, being able to reduce costs for applications that do not need to be running 24/7, being able to more closely align, hey, we need this service up Monday through Friday, we do not need it on the weekend, or hey, we need this service up as we do end of month processing, we do not need it up for the rest of the month. You can take advantage of having, okay, I can turn those machines on, I can turn that service on when I require it, and I can turn it off and not necessarily pay for it when I don't. Starting small and growing fast. So this comes back to how quickly can we get a project off the ground, how quickly can we innovate, how much budget are we going to ask for to get these proof of concepts started. And when you talk about Azure, you can start very small. You can start with a proof of concept. You can start with the development environment. And then as that project proves itself out and as it becomes more useful and as it becomes a success, the resources it require will grow and the cost will grow along with that. So again, more closely aligning that budget to what's actually required by the project as opposed to having to set a budgetary number that is far above what the initial phase of the project costs, because that's what you need to make sure that it gets into phase 2 and phase 3. Unpredictable bursting. So one of the great things about the cloud, that's scalability, the ability to scale up and scale down. So web applications, websites, things that are potentially something will go viral or something will be very popular, or you're selling tickets to an event, and you'll have a period where you need more resources than maybe what you have for the rest of the month, for the rest of the year. Well, with Azure, we can start automating that scale up and scale down process based on the requirements of the real-time requirements of the application. And again, take advantage of the cost savings, not running those services, not running those machines when requests are low, and then scaling out and scaling up when requests are high. And then similarly to unpredictable bursting, predictable bursting. So going back to the things that payroll that's used once every 2 weeks, things that are used at the end of the month, things that are very predictable around like holidays or seasonally. That is another great use of where you can start seeing real cost savings by, again, more closely aligning your spend with what's actually being used by the solution or application. So getting started with the hybrid cloud. So when you think about the hybrid cloud and once you want to get started with the hybrid cloud, we're going to talk about two big things. Again, one of the pillars of Azure is that it is built from the ground up to be hybrid. Microsoft understands that organizations have made investments in their on-premise technology stack. They understand they've made investments in their data center. They also understand that there are going to be some workloads and applications that will make, for the foreseeable future, more sense on-prem than in the cloud. So they really give you a lot of opportunity to enable this hybrid connectivity. So making your virtual network, making your virtual machines in the public cloud look like they are parts of your on-premise network, giving you the ability to manage them with the same tools that you manage them with now. And the way they do that is by doing things like site-to-site VPNs or ExpressRoute. So there's sort of three ways to enable hybrid connectivity into an Azure virtual network. The first is an IPsec VPN over the public internet. So you use your on-premise access point. You have a server in Microsoft that's managed by Microsoft. You don't have to do anything about it, running routing and remote access. And it is an IPsec tunnel over the public internet. So you can address anything in your Microsoft virtual network with the stuff that you have on-premise. Things in the cloud can see stuff on-premise. Things in the cloud can talk to things on-premise. The second and third scenarios here are something called ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute is an MPLS connection and a circuit directly into Microsoft's data centers, either provided by an exchange provider or a network service provider. With a site-to-site VPN tunnel, you're maxed at 200 megabits a second on the high performance. Because it goes over the public internet, there is no necessary SLA on what type of performance you get. They will just give you an up to this number. With ExpressRoute, you can get speeds that are much higher. You can get speeds up to 10 gigabits a second, and Microsoft will back those by a financially guaranteed SLA of certain levels of performance. The other important thing to note here when it comes to thinking about what makes the most sense for you is things that go into Azure, into the cloud, what's called ingress bandwidth, so things that you send up to Azure, does not have any charge associated with it. So I send files and things up to Azure, that cost is free. Microsoft is not going to charge me anything for that. Egress bandwidth, things that come out of the cloud, generally carry a per gig cost with them. So on an IPsec tunnel, on a site-to-site VPN scenario, you are going to pay for outbound bandwidth from your cloud services. When you go into ExpressRoute and an MPLS connection, you have the option to either continue to pay for bandwidth. You also have the option to have that bandwidth paid for with the cost of the circuit, so unlimited bandwidth. So one of the things, there's obviously a performance thing that drives site-to-site VPN versus ExpressRoute, but there is also occasionally a cost thing that will drive site-to-site VPN versus ExpressRoute depending on how much egress bandwidth you think that you're going to need. The second big part about moving to a hybrid cloud environment is identity. Identity is very important to Microsoft. I'm not sure how familiar this group is with things like the Enterprise Mobility Suite, Azure Active Directory Premium, but one of the things that you'll see as you look at Microsoft's vision for what the future of work looks like is very much that they see identity as a security boundary. So now that things are moving outside the domain and the firewall, the new security boundary is knowing who the user is, making sure that user identity is managed, monitored, maintained by the organization. One of the things that you'll want to think about when you're setting up a hybrid cloud environment is what you're going to do about identity. One of the most common workloads that we see running in the cloud today is Active Directory Federated Services, ADFS, to do single sign-on for things like Office 365, Dynamics, Intune, single sign-on to other third-party or line of business applications as well. And there's a couple of really good reasons for that. The first is that high availability in the cloud means that if the on-premise AD goes down, your users can still access their cloud services. They still have access to their email if it's in Office 365, etc. The other reason that ADFS or even just a domain controller in the cloud is so powerful is because once you have that hybrid connectivity set up and once you have that identity set up, all of the other dominoes start falling into place. So all of the other workloads that you might think about moving into the cloud, your tier 2, tier 3 applications become a lot easier once you've established hybrid connectivity and hybrid identity. So that connectivity and that identity tend to be the first dominoes to fall when you're thinking about any cloud strategy, but a hybrid cloud strategy especially, because that's the grease that lets all of these other workloads on your roadmap, all the other things that you're thinking could be maybe improved by a cloud strategy or a cloud solution, makes all of that easier to migrate. Some other common workloads that we see that are very much hybrid environments, that are enabled by hybrid environments that do not necessarily require you to move full production stack into the cloud, but let you do that some on-prem and some up in the cloud that we're seeing right now that are getting a lot of traction in Azure are backups. So doing things like replacing tape solutions with low-cost Azure storage, so storage in Azure anywhere from 2 cents to 8 cents a gig, depending on what type of redundancy and resiliency you want for that data. Having offsite backups, data center replacements for small businesses. There is a device called the Store Simple appliance that some of you may have heard of. It is a hybrid cloud iSCSI target that will do encryption, deduplication, snapshotting, and algorithmic tiering from an on-premise environment. It is actually a physical device into a virtual environment. So really good for backing up a file server, really good for disaster recovery, and looks like an enterprise SAN, right? So it has on-premise solid state storage, it has on-premise spinning media, rotating media, and then as the working set, as the hot set of data ages out, algorithmically tiers that into the cloud so that you're paying much lower cost than you would to slap another disk inside your existing SAN. Dev test environments, again, not necessarily moving full production workloads, but starting to empower developers to have access to cloud solutions, starting to be able to give your developers the ability to spin up and spin down VMs whenever they want, as opposed to having to request those resources. Making sure that you're, succeeding fast, failing fast, getting proof of concepts, getting projects off the ground, seeing if they prove themselves out, and then tearing them down without the requisitely large cost that exists on an on-premise environment. Also gives you a lot of abilities with things like Azure Dev Test Labs and the way that we can template out virtual machines in Azure to make sure that what the developers have access to, what they can do, what needs to be automated, shut down, spin up, reduces the cost of an existing dev and test environment. And then using Azure as a secondary data center for disaster recovery. So there is a product that Microsoft purchased a couple years ago called InMage. InMage's claim to fame was VMware to VMware migrations. Microsoft bought it and rolled it into a project called Azure Site Recovery. Azure Site Recovery does block level replication into latent VHDs, latent machines in Azure, gives you the ability to orchestrate failover, and then in the event of a disaster, gives you the ability to press the big red button and spin up to virtual machines in the Azure environment. Unlike having a secondary data center, having active-active or active-passive setups, which were prohibitively expensive for many businesses, using Azure as your secondary data center and as your disaster recovery point, making secondary data centers for disaster recovery a lot more affordable for a larger subset of organizations. Another thing that we're seeing with Azure Site Recovery is it's a very powerful migration tool. So as you think about what workloads you're going to move to Azure, instead of thinking about, okay, well, we'll have to do all new greenfield migration into virtual machines, we can use Azure Site Recovery to replicate the workloads on-premise, make sure everything works, spin up those workloads in Azure using the big red button, the failover button, and then just never fail back. So a much cleaner and simpler migration path to Azure than was previously available. And with that, and because obviously I'm experiencing some difficulties with my headset, I am going to turn it over to Ken Pribble, one of our senior Microsoft architects, to talk about the ways that PCM approaches cloud adoption and the ways that we can assist customers that are looking to migrate into the cloud. Ken?
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick introduction. My name's Ken Pribble. I am a senior Microsoft Azure architect for PCM OnPoint. specializing in Azure, Azure Identity, and Azure Migrations. Could we jump to the next slide, John? PCM OnPoint has a very robust Azure Services capabilities practice. We do not dabble in every single Azure service, but we have a lot of experience in doing service delivery for Microsoft Azure IaaS platforms, some platform as a service platforms, do literally hundreds. We have hundreds of customers that we've done identity and Azure Connectivity, VPN, Azure Design, as well as Azure Site Recovery and Backup. Those are the areas that we specialize in most. We're seeing a lot of advancement most recently in the last 12 months with complete data center or complete infrastructure replacements, or as close as businesses can get to that point. We're probably working with somewhere in hundreds of customers who are building out various bits and pieces of the Azure infrastructure, whether those are infrastructure as a service or software as a service and everything in between. Next slide, please. Some of the cornerstones that we build a lot of those things around are Azure Identity Management, whether that be just simple integration with Office 365 or fully extended Azure Active Directory Premium or Azure Active Directory Federated Services to help you manage those identity services as you make this transformation into the cloud and start consuming cloud services, whether they're Microsoft services or third-party services. John mentioned earlier the importance of being able to secure your data and services, regardless of where they're at, with your own managed user identities, and the ability to extend your existing on-premise Active Directory, for example, to an Azure Active Directory, Office 365 integrated Active Directory, or even beyond that with Active Directory Federation services to allow you to federate those identities for your customers or your internal identities to other SaaS providers like ADP timekeeping, Salesforce. We can help you implement all of those types of features, as well as many of the Azure Active Directory Premium features to help you streamline your IT operations, possibly getting you out of the password reset business from a help desk standpoint by implementing self-service password reset portals in Azure, doing password vaulting so you can expose publicly available services that are company-owned, things like Twitter accounts, Facebook pages, to internal resources without having to divulge the actual account passwords. And as soon as you make changes in your Active Directory on-premise, those changes are reflected in those cloud applications, even to the extent of doing automatic user provisioning in SaaS applications based on users showing up in Active Directory. We also do quite a bit of work around SQL in Azure and analysis around SQL Server IaaS versus SQL Server PaaS and the differences between those two platforms. As John mentioned earlier, SQL Server PaaS can be a very, very cost-effective platform depending on the SQL services that your applications need. And we do have expertise around determining is a SQL Server PaaS instance, for example, going to facilitate all of my application needs, or do I have special needs, additional reporting services, for example, or data manipulation services that aren't available in the PaaS platform that maybe I want to do that still as an IaaS type SQL Server, but still make those things work together and still interface that data up through even a platform as a service web server if it's a public-facing website. Doing hybrid SQL where I have a SQL Server on-premise with a redundant, always-on scenario in Azure so that I can assure that high availability, or being able to scale those Azure SQL instances for peak online transaction processing and those types of scenarios. We also do quite a bit of website configuration in Azure, where if you need that scalability, if you're, for example, have a public-facing site and need to have seasonal scalability, helping you work out the architecture to make those types of tiers in your application scalable so that they will even auto-scale to the extent of, when one web server gets too busy, another web server instance is automatically spawned and added to the pool and automatically load balanced. And many of those services for things like load balancing are very inexpensive in Azure versus doing those in an on-prem environment. So you can have scalable farms in a much more aggressive manner and don't have that large investment in hardware-based load balancers, for example. Also, SharePoint deployments and migrations from on-premise to SharePoint Online or even SharePoint in IaaS in Azure. There are some things that scale very well and migrate from an on-premise SharePoint environment to a SharePoint Online Office 365 environment, but there are some services that customers have custom workflows, third-party application web parts and things that may or may not always come across and work straight in SharePoint Online. We can assist with those evaluations and have tools to actually scan your environment, identify where those caveats might be, and assist you with developing a roadmap on what would be the best way to do those kinds of migrations. Let's go to the next slide, John, please. Normally with new customers, our approach as we kind of work to help you as a customer complete this journey to the cloud, we have a very methodical approach to help you move the right pieces to Azure. While Azure is a wonderful platform, it's maybe not necessarily the perfect platform for every application. And helping you gain an understanding, typically we start this journey with an education with the customer about the platform, because obviously as a customer, if you've never used the product, you only know what you know. And helping you gain an understanding of the building blocks in Azure, what things may be an easy move and migration to Azure versus what things may be more difficult, what applications may require remediation prior to moving to Azure, or what applications may actually require a redesign to really take advantage of the platform. One of the beauties of Azure is you don't have to do everything at once. You can take this journey and do things a piece at a time, what makes sense, what makes the most cost-effective way for you to get there. And you can even do it in steps. So typically we start with an education process. We do have some programs available currently to help with education and assessment of your existing environments. Microsoft is running some programs currently, an Azure Everywhere education program as well as an Azure Fast Start assessment program that are fully funded Microsoft engagements that will allow, if you qualify for those types of engagements under an education engagement with Azure Everywhere, we will actually send one of our Azure engineers to your site to spend time with your IT staff, your business stakeholders, give you an education on the Azure platform, the Azure building blocks, and the appropriate technologies of interest. And that's up to a 4-day engagement. That's a real whiteboarding session with you and an engineer and probably a test tenant where you can touch, feel, and discuss how those technologies could be applied to your workloads and give you some comfortability on whatever technologies that you may have questions about, whether it be security, compliance, operations, management, cost control, what what would be the best types of workloads to take a look at. As a follow-on to that, there's also what they call an Azure assessment engagement that we can make available to customers, that if you are interested, we can install a third-party tool set into your virtual environment. It's a set of agents that get installed on your existing virtual machines and physical servers and allow us to collect data about the application and services and provide you with some insight that you may not already have about your environment. Those agents collect not only processor utilization, disk I/O, networking traffic I/O, but they also collect service-to-service endpoint communication to give you some insight into what's happening from a networking standpoint for all of the applications. What are the interrelationships between my various virtual machines, various services, and other services running elsewhere in the environment? That will allow us to help you develop a strategic plan to determine which workloads are easily moved, maybe, and what are the requirements around those workloads to make sure we get the environment sized correctly, rather than just do a lift and shift. Just because you have a machine sized on premise as a two-core processor, 16 gig of memory virtual machine in VMware doesn't necessarily mean that's the resources that it's using, and it may not be cost effective to just lift and shift that. Maybe we want to adjust the size as it moves into Azure. Also, it gives us insight into the networking capabilities and requirements of those applications and relationships, so that as you start to design Azure network security groups and security boundaries to maintain compliance, because the cloud network design is a little different, you can maybe get a little more aggressive there and really understand the traffic patterns. Those tools also allow us to take that data and run it through a machine learning algorithm in Azure and produce documentation for you to kind of give you a strategic migration plan as far as what workloads might need remediation before they could be moved to Azure, what workloads may need a redesign, or things you may want to look at and caveats you may want to consider before moving, and frankly, what workloads may not be compatible at all for whatever reason. It also lets us right size and estimate the actual Azure cost spend that you would expect to see if those workloads were running in Azure, based on right-sized virtual machines, right-sized, right-price storage, and even down to the network ingress-egress estimations, so that you really have a good target feel for this is what Azure is really going to cost me. Following on from those engagements, typically those would evolve into some sort of a proof of concept type of engagement. If you were wanting to put up some sort of a proof of concept around any of those technologies or workloads, where we can utilize some of the native services to do test migrations, test build-outs, dev test platforms, so that you can touch and feel some of those pieces and utilize those services in your environment. As I mentioned, currently we're working with a number of customers. We're seeing a lot of traction. Some of our larger in-flight projects that we're running right now. We're currently working with a company based out of Northern California that specializes in corporate risk management and analysis, big data risk management. They currently have data centers located in North America as well as in England, and they had a DR center located in Iceland. They were spending a ton of money on maintaining all three of the data centers. They actually produce a piece of software that is a SaaS offering, software as a service offering, that their customers purchase and use their environment. So it's a completely virtualized instance for each customer. They wanted to look for a solution that would allow them to maybe give up and close down some of those on-prem data centers. And because they are in essence, a SaaS cloud service provider. They wanted to move their infrastructure to the cloud. This is not a small operation by any means. For this customer, we were talking somewhere in the range of 2,500 virtual machines. This project is currently in flight, but we were currently tasked with the first couple of phases. The first thing they wanted to do was get rid of their on-premise disaster recovery data center that also happened to house most of their dev test environment. In order to make that data center go away, we needed to migrate their existing VMware SRM workloads from their DR data center up into Azure, and we're able to do that using the Azure Site Recovery tool to replace VMware SRM, create those machine replicas, give them a new DR plan to migrate those DR services so that those on-premise workloads were no longer protected by VMware data center to data center. They're protected by Azure Site Recovery from their main data center up into Microsoft Azure. We also utilize the same tools to migrate their entire test dev environment that was all co-located with the DR inside the DR data center up into Azure as a production / test dev environment. Because this company is a SaaS provider, their long-term goal is to optimize their platform for delivery through Azure. However, they have a massive amount of applications, and it's going to take them some time to optimize some of those applications for delivery through Azure. So this first step allowed them to close their disaster recovery data center. In phase 2 that's currently underway, we're actually helping them automate the migration of their production data center loads as they are currently architected up into additional Azure instances, and protect those new Azure instances for their production through ASR to additional Azure regions so that they can give up all of their, or the bulk of their on-premise data center offerings. We're using a number of Azure automation tools to help facilitate that. The key thing there is with the flexibility of the Azure platform now, you don't have to re-architect everything as you start the migration process. You can take this in pieces. There are a number of third-party marketplace offerings that allow you to take existing architectures that are tried and true in your existing environment, virtualize the entire architecture, and move that into Azure. In this example with this risk management company, they had a very complicated network security architecture that was all protected with Palo Alto on-premise devices. We were able to help them take that existing architecture, virtualize the entire architecture, including virtual Palo Altos in Azure, and reconstruct that in Microsoft Azure so that those workloads from an architecture standpoint would move up and allow them to start seeing some savings from the cost of those data centers and get out of that management and maintenance business and devote more resources toward the development of their applications and servicing of their customers. So I guess what the bottom line is there are a lot of tool sets out there. We have extensive experience and a very, very deep and broad services delivery methodology and structure to help you facilitate the move. These projects start typically very small and gradually spool up. It doesn't matter whether the existing environment is physical, VMware-based, Hyper-V based from a virtualization standpoint. There are pathways to get from A to B. We do understand that Azure is not, it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, it's not the perfect platform for everything, and there will always be some need for, whether it be legacy applications, legacy hardware, other issues that prevent, compliance issues that that absolutely prevent data from moving up into the cloud, and helping you configure that hybrid architecture so that you can expose the services you need from a public standpoint, absorb and get the cost savings of moving towards a cloud platform, maybe get out of the hardware acquisition business, and give you some guidance as well as far as, do I bring my existing licensing that I already own with me to Azure? Do I pay for licensing as I go? And we have a deep understanding about what the ramifications are of those decisions as well. So if you'd like to have discussions regarding those things, we can facilitate that as well. With that, I'm going to open it up with John to questions and answers.
Thanks very much, Ken. Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple minutes left here, on for some Q&A. Obviously, piggybacking on what Ken just said, if you guys are looking for assistance, if you want to have further discussions, please reach out. I think Aman will be sending some follow-up, or your on-point or PCM account executive can help get in touch with us and get you the support that you need.
Okay, thank you so much for a great presentation. We have got a few questions. I'll try to cover all of those, but the questions which will be left, I will have our speakers to, answer them, and we'll email you back. Okay, the first question is, can you speak to the ability for the enterprises to completely eliminate on-site Active Directory? Are companies doing this? It's by Matt.
So Ken would probably be the best person. Depends on what you mean. From my take on that, what you mean by eliminate, if you're just talking about putting Active Directory in virtual machines and Azure, that is very much possible. If you are talking about eliminating the need for an AD completely, we are seeing Microsoft make a lot of investments in things like Intune, which not only does mobile device management, but will also manage Windows client PCs, bringing a lot more group policy aspects to some of their newer rollouts and builds of Windows that I think will eliminate a lot of the need for that. As far as on servers joining, there is Azure Active Directory domain services that will take some of that. So I think the feasibility right now for a fully AD-less environment is you would have to be in a pretty specific edge case that you would be willing to give up some features for, but long-term I think that's going to be very much a possibility. Ken, do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree with that. We actually have a number of customers that are trying to move that way. It really comes down to how many legacy applications you have, how you manage your existing environment, and what those management needs are, and whether those can be currently replaced. There are still some limitations with the services that are available now on what we can do with things like group policy management, what we can do with older desktop operating systems and even older server operating systems from a management standpoint. As John mentioned, if you're a new startup and you're all Windows 10 and you're Office 365 integrated, et cetera, there is the potential that you could get there. Unfortunately, for most companies, there are a handful of legacy items that still require traditional Active Directory and traditional Active Directory management to facilitate some of those things. So a lot of times that ends up being some sort of a hybrid. There's still going to be a need for some basic services on premise anyway. In most environments, you need to maintain for your on-prem environments, on-prem connectivity, resolution services. Sometimes you might not want to have the basic authentication services located as far away from the cloud. Most other services are available in Azure. Right now, as John mentioned, I think we're about 95% of the way there. For very special use cases, we can get all the way there, but there's still a little bit of work to be done there.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Luis Escobar. He's saying, I need, if I'm not saying it right, I need worldwide, I think, Azure services. Someone can call me. I'm interested in partner alliance. I need servers.
We can absolutely help you out with that. Naman, if you could take contact information, we can follow up. We obviously not only from the technical acumen that I hope we've demonstrated here today, but we are a Microsoft licensing solution provider, so we are authorized to sell and resell all of Microsoft services as well as their largest licensing agreements. So we can definitely talk about that.
Cool, thank you. The next question is from Danny Lee. We would like to migrate our ad and file server to Azure. Our staffs collaborate on files on a daily basis. Is it possible to prevent staff from overwriting each other's work?
So it is in a lot of those cases, and going back to the IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS, we would first look at whether some of that stuff is available with like SharePoint Online. It might be a little bit of a change from how you're collaborating right now, but a lot of that stuff like versioning, checking in and checking out of files is natively built into SharePoint, whereas I think you'd have to get pretty customized with how you're doing that in like a file server. Ken, is that your read on that?
Absolutely. The only way to without writing some sort of a custom front end, the only way to expose bare files, just a file repository in Azure right now is to place it in a Windows file server IaaS configuration, which means you have to have direct connectivity to the file server. There's no web style interface to those files, so it comes through your normal network, looks like a file server, talks like a file server, really isn't a file server. If there are some considerations you should probably make. Locking isn't necessarily an issue unless you're looking at multiple geographies, and then the replication between those geographies, making those active at this point may require some additional third-party tools as well.
Okay, thank you so much. So we are short of time, so questions which are left unanswered, I will send it to the speakers and we'll answer those and send it back to you shortly. Okay, so with that, thank you so much, John and Ken, for a great presentation. And thank you all for joining in today. Have a great day ahead, and we will see you in the future webinars. Thank you so much.